In the bitter winter of 1944, deep within the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes, a group of American soldiers found themselves trapped behind enemy lines, hunted like animals by one of Nazi Germany's most ruthless military units. What began as a routine patrol would become one of the most harrowing survival stories of World War II, culminating in a vengeful counterattack that would forever change the course of the Battle of the Bulge. This is the true story of how General George S. Patton's Third Army turned the hunters into the hunted, delivering a brutal reckoning that the Waffen-SS would never forget. The date was December 16, 1944. Hitler's last desperate gamble, Operation Watch on the Rhine, had just begun. The German offensive caught Allied forces completely off guard, with 3 German armies smashing through the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes Forest. Among the chaos and confusion of that first day, 2nd Lieutenant James McReynolds of the 106th Infantry Division found himself separated from his unit with 15 men, deep in territory that was rapidly falling under German control. These weren't green recruits, though they were part of what the Germans mockingly called a ghost division, due to their recent arrival in the sector. These were battle-hardened veterans who had survived the Normandy landings and fought their way across France. As dawn broke on December 17th, McReynolds and his men realized the gravity of their situation. Radio contact with their headquarters had been lost, and the sounds of German armor could be heard rumbling through the valleys below their position. What they didn't know was that they had stumbled directly into the path of the 1st SS Panzer, Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, one of the most elite and ruthless units in the German military. Led by SS Oberfuhrer Wilhelm Mohnke, this division had earned a fearsome reputation not just for their fighting ability, but for their complete disregard for the rules of warfare. The first encounter came without warning. Private Tommy Kowalski, a farm boy from Wisconsin who had joined the army on his 18th birthday, was on watch when he spotted movement in the tree line. What he saw made his blood run cold. A patrol of SS soldiers in their distinctive camouflage smocks was methodically searching the forest, moving with the practiced efficiency of experienced hunters. But these weren't ordinary German soldiers. The Waffen-SS troops carried themselves with an arrogance that was immediately apparent, their weapons at the ready, their eyes scanning every shadow with deadly intent. McReynolds gathered his men in a hastily dug foxhole, their breath forming clouds in the freezing air as he whispered his orders. They would have to move, and they would have to move now. But as they prepared to withdraw deeper into the forest, the distinctive crack of a Gewehr 43 rifle shattered the morning silence. Private Henderson, a quiet kid from Alabama who carried pictures of his sweetheart in his breast pocket, dropped without a sound, blood staining the pristine snow around him. The hunt had begun. What followed was a nightmarish game of cat and mouse that would last for 6 days. The SS troops, emboldened by their early successes in the offensive and driven by their fanatical ideology, seemed to take a perverse pleasure in tracking down the scattered American survivors. They moved through the forest with methodical precision, using their knowledge of the terrain and their superior winter equipment to slowly tighten the noose around McReynolds' dwindling band of survivors. Each day brought new horrors, new losses, and the growing realization that surrender was not an option. The Waffen-SS had already made their intentions clear at Malmedy, where over 80 American prisoners had been machine-gunned in cold blood. Just hours into the offensive, Sergeant Bill Murphy, a veteran of the Italian campaign who had seen more than his share of combat, took it upon himself to cover the group's retreat. Armed with a Thompson submachine gun and carrying extra ammunition stripped from the dead, Murphy moved like a ghost through the snow-laden pines. His Irish ancestry had blessed him with a natural ability to blend into his surroundings, and his Experience in the mountains of Italy had taught him how to use terrain to his advantage. For 3 days, he played a deadly game with the pursuing SS troops, using hit-and-run tactics that slowly began to frustrate his pursuers. But the Germans were learning too. SS Hauptsturmführer Klaus Weber, the officer leading the pursuit, was a veteran of the Eastern Front who had earned his reputation hunting Soviet partisans in the forests of Belarus. He recognized the tactics being used against his men and began to adapt accordingly. Weber split his force, using radio communication to coordinate a pincer movement designed to trap the Americans in an ever-shrinking pocket. He also brought up specialized mountain troops, soldiers who were experts in winter warfare and tracking, men who could move through the snow as silently as the wind itself. The psychological warfare was perhaps even more brutal than the physical pursuit. The SS troops would call out in broken English during the long winter nights, taunting the hiding Americans with promises of warm food and medical treatment if they surrendered. They would describe in graphic detail what had happened to other American prisoners, painting vivid pictures of torture and execution that were designed to break the will of men already pushed to their physical and emotional limits. Some of the younger soldiers began to crack under the pressure, but McReynolds held them together through sheer force of personality and the unshakable belief that relief was coming. On the 4th day, tragedy struck in the cruelest possible way. Corporal Danny Williams, barely 19 years old and the youngest member of the group, had been weakened by dysentery and exposure. As the group moved through a particularly dense section of forest, Williams collapsed in the snow, unable to continue. McReynolds faced an agonizing decision. They couldn't carry Williams without slowing down the entire group, and the sounds of pursuit were getting closer by the hour. Williams himself made the decision, pressing his sidearm into McReynolds' hand and whispering a final message for his mother back in Detroit. The sound of that single gunshot echoed through the forest like a death knell, but it also served another purpose. Miles away, at the headquarters of the Third Army, General George S. Patton was studying intelligence reports that painted an increasingly grim picture of the situation in the Ardennes. Patton, known for his aggressive tactics and his deep loyalty to his men, was growing increasingly frustrated with the defensive posture that had been forced upon the Allied forces. When word reached him of the systematic hunting of American survivors by SS units, something inside the old warrior snapped. Patton had been preparing for exactly this moment. While other commanders had been caught off guard by the German offensive, Patton had anticipated the possibility of a major German attack and had quietly positioned elements of his Third Army for a rapid response. Now, as reports filtered in of American soldiers being hunted down like animals by SS troops who showed no mercy and took no prisoners, Patton saw an opportunity not just for tactical victory, but for revenge. The general's war room became a hive of activity as staff officers worked around the clock to coordinate what would become one of the most rapid and effective military pivots in history. Patton's plan was characteristically bold and uncompromising. He would pull 3 full divisions out of their current positions, march them over 100 miles in the dead of winter, and launch a massive counterattack directly into the southern flank of the German advance. But this wouldn't be just any counterattack. Patton was planning something that would send a clear message to the Waffen-SS about the price of hunting American soldiers. Meanwhile, in the Ardennes, McReynolds and his 7 remaining men were reaching the end of their endurance. They had been without food for 2 days, surviving on melted snow and the occasional handful of frozen berries. Their ammunition was running dangerously low, and frostbite was beginning to claim fingers and toes. Worse still, the SS troops seemed to be everywhere now, their distinctive camouflage patterns visible through the trees, like deadly flowers blooming in a winter garden of death. It was Sergeant Murphy who heard them first, the low rumble of tank engines, but coming from the wrong direction. The Germans had been approaching from the north and east, but these sounds were coming from the south. Murphy, his face gaunt from hunger and marked by 6 days of constant fear, allowed himself the first smile he had managed since the ordeal began. He had served under Patton in Sicily and recognized the distinctive sound of American Sherman tanks when he heard them. The 4th Armored Division, spearhead of Patton's relief force, had been driving almost non-stop for 3 days, their crews surviving on coffee and determination as they raced to reach the trapped soldiers in the Ardennes. Tank Commander Captain Rick Morrison, a veteran of the drive across France, had pushed his Sherman to its mechanical limits, the treads throwing up clouds of snow as they churned through the forest roads that had been deemed impassable by hire. Command, what happened next would become the stuff of legend in the annals of armored warfare. Morrison's lead tanks crested a small ridge and immediately spotted the SS troops who had been pursuing McReynolds' group. The German soldiers, so focused on their hunt that they had failed to post adequate security, were caught completely off guard by the appearance of American armor. The first 75mm shell from Morrison's gun struck an SS machine gun position, obliterating the crew and sending a clear message that the hunted had become the hunters. But Patton's revenge was just beginning. Following close behind the armor came elements of the 80th Infantry Division, soldiers who had been briefed in graphic detail about the treatment of American prisoners by SS units. These weren't men looking for a fair fight or concerned with the niceties of warfare. They were soldiers with a score to settle, and they had been given implicit permission by their commanding general to settle it in whatever manner they saw. Fit SS Hauptsturmführer Weber found himself trapped between the anvil of American armor and the hammer of American infantry that seemed to appear from every direction at once. His radio calls for support went unanswered as the larger German offensive was already beginning to crumble under the weight of Patton's broader counterattack. Weber realized that his hunter-killer teams, so effective at tracking down isolated American survivors, were completely unsuited for conventional combat against a determined enemy with superior firepower. The battle that followed was as brutal as it was one-sided. American tank crews, many of whom had lost friends to SS atrocities, showed no mercy to German soldiers attempting to surrender. Infantry squads methodically cleared SS positions with flamethrowers and grenades, paying particular attention to any German soldiers wearing the distinctive SS runes on their collars. The message was clear and unmistakable. There would be consequences for hunting American soldiers like animals. McReynolds and his surviving men were found by a patrol from the 80th Infantry Division on the evening of December 22nd, exactly 6 days after their ordeal had begun. The lieutenant, barely recognizable after nearly a week of surviving in freezing conditions while being hunted by the enemy, broke down completely when he saw the American flag patch on his rescuer's shoulder. Of the 16 men who had started this journey, only 8 had survived to see rescue. But their survival and the brutal price extracted for their suffering would send shockwaves through the German military that would be felt for the remainder of the war. The tactical implications of Patton's counterattack extended far beyond the rescue of a single isolated unit. The Third Army's rapid pivot and devastating assault on the southern flank of the German advance had caught the Wehrmacht completely off guard, disrupting timetables and forcing German commanders to divert crucial resources from their main offensive efforts. Within days, the entire character of the Battle of the Bulge had changed from a German offensive to an American counteroffensive. But perhaps more importantly, word of what had happened to Weber's SS hunting teams spread rapidly through the German military grapevine. Stories of American tanks deliberately targeting SS positions, of American infantry showing the same lack of mercy that the SS had shown to American prisoners, began to undermine German morale in ways that conventional military victories never could. The Wehrmacht began to realize that the Americans had fundamentally changed the rules of engagement. Patton himself visited the rescued survivors in a field hospital 3 days after their rescue, awarding each man the Bronze Star for their courage. Under fire, but it was his conversation with McReynolds that revealed the true depth of his fury over what had happened in those dark forests. The general, known for his colorful language and aggressive demeanor, spoke quietly to the young lieutenant about the price of hunting American soldiers and the debt that had been paid in German blood. The aftermath of the rescue operation became a template for American operations for the remainder of the war in Europe. SS units, once confident in their superior training and fanatical dedication, began to show signs of the same fear that they had once instilled in their enemies. Reports filtered back to Berlin of SS officers refusing to engage isolated American units, preferring instead to withdraw rather than risk the kind of vengeful counterattack that had destroyed Weber's force. The psychological impact on German morale was profound and far-reaching. The Waffen-SS had built their reputation on being the hunters, the elite predators who showed no mercy and expected none in return. But Patton's brutal counterattack had fundamentally changed that dynamic, proving that Americans could be every bit as ruthless as their SS counterparts when properly motivated. The hunter-killer teams that had been so effective in the early days of the offensive were quietly disbanded, their survivors reassigned to conventional combat roles, where the rules of warfare provided at least some protection. For McReynolds and his surviving men, the war continued, but it was never quite the same. The experience of being hunted through the forests of the Ardennes had changed them in fundamental ways, hardening them into the kind of soldiers that the SS had once believed themselves to be. They would go on to fight in the final campaigns of the war, but they would do so with the knowledge that they had survived the worst that the enemy could throw at them and lived to see their tormentors destroyed. The rescue operation also marked a turning point in Patton's own relationship with the war. The general, already known for his aggressive tactics and his willingness to push the limits of acceptable behavior, had crossed a line in the forests of the Ardennes. His deliberate orchestration of revenge against SS units had been as much about personal satisfaction as military necessity, and the success of the operation had validated his belief that sometimes the only way to deal with a brutal enemy was to be more brutal in return. Years after the war, historians would debate the ethics of Patton's actions during the Ardennes counterattack. Some would argue that the systematic targeting of SS units constituted a war crime in itself, while others would contend that it was a necessary and proportional response to German atrocities. But for the men who lived through those 6 days of being hunted like animals in the freezing forests, there was no debate. Patton had kept his promise to his soldiers, and the price had been paid in full. The story of McReynolds and his men became part of the legend of the Third Army, told and retold in barracks and veterans' halls for decades after the war ended. It served as a reminder that even in the darkest moments, when survival seemed impossible and the enemy appeared unstoppable, rescue could come from the most unexpected directions. But it also served as a warning to anyone who might consider hunting American soldiers for sport. There would always be a reckoning, and it would be swift, brutal, and absolute. The Battle of the Bulge would continue for several more weeks, with both sides suffering tremendous casualties as winter weather and determined resistance ground the German offensive to a halt. But the character of the battle had been fundamentally changed by those 6 days in December, when a small group of American soldiers refused to surrender and a determined general refused to abandon them. The hunters had become the hunted, and the price for that transformation had been paid in blood and snow in the dark forests of the Ardennes. In the final accounting, Weber's SS hunting teams had succeeded in eliminating 8 American soldiers. During their 6-day reign of terror, Patton's counterattack had killed or captured over 300 SS troops in less than 24 hours, sending a message that resonated throughout the German military for the remainder of the war. The mathematics of revenge had been calculated with typical American efficiency, and the ledger had been balanced with interest. The legacy of those dark December days would outlive all the participants, becoming part of the larger story of American determination and the refusal to abandon soldiers in need. McReynolds would return home to a hero's welcome and a Congressional Medal of Honor, but he would never speak publicly about those 6 days when he and his men were hunted through the snow by soldiers who showed no mercy and expected none in return. Some stories, he would say years later, were better left to the history books and the memories of those who lived them. Patton's Third Army would go on to become one of the most feared and respected military formations in American history, but it was forged in moments like these, when the choice between honor and survival, between mercy and vengeance, had to be made in split seconds by men who understood that the price of freedom was sometimes measured in the blood of enemies who had forgotten that Americans, when pushed to their limits, could be every bit as ruthless as any SS officer who had ever worn the lightning bolt runes of the Schutzstaffel. The forests of the Ardennes eventually returned to their peaceful state, the snow covering the scars of battle and the graves of men who had died far from home. But the story lived on, a testament to the courage of soldiers who refused to surrender and the determination of a general who refused to let his men be hunted like animals by an enemy that had forgotten the basic rules of human decency. In the injustice had been served with the cold efficiency of American steel and the hot fury of American vengeance, and the hunters had learned what it meant to become the hunted.